Let me just start by thanking John and everybody for showing up, and John for inviting me to present on Adam Smith. And I hope you'll actually be able to follow this and enjoy the presentation and learn something from it. What I'm going to do is just talk about the 5 things that are on the first PowerPoint. I'm going to say a little bit about Adam Smith and his world. I'm going to talk about some of the standard views of Smith and some of the problems with it. I'm going to talk about Adam Smith on wages, Adam Smith on usury, focus on Bentham's critique, and you're ahead of the game, yeah. And then wrap things up with summary and conclusions. Okay, now next PowerPoint. Okay, Adam Smith was born in a little town, Kirkcaldy, near Edinburgh, June 16th, 1723. All of you should pay attention to the date. Next year, around this time, a little bit later than the end of April, will be the tricentennial of Adam Smith's birth. So those of you who are interested in Adam Smith, now's a good time to start writing papers on Adam Smith, because they will be in great demand. And those of you who are journal editors, now's a good time to start corralling papers on Adam Smith, because around a year from now, everybody's going to be interested in Adam Smith. As John mentioned, I was Robert Heilbronner's student at the New School back in the late 70s, early 1980s. And I wrote my doctoral dissertation under Bob, and my dissertation was on Francois Quesnay and the Tableau économique. A little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. The title of my talk, which is the paradoxically wonderful world, or the wonderfully paradoxical world of, you're going too fast here. You're on the next PowerPoint now. Good. I'm still at the beginning of this one. Robert Heilbronner's chapter on Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations describes Smith as being just this sort of bumbling, absent-minded professor. That really surprised me, and I guess is true. But Smith studied first moral philosophy, then maths and political economy at Glasgow. Then he studied at Oxford. He became chair of logic at Glasgow, and then chair of moral philosophy. And his 2 major works are things that are pretty well known: the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was published in 1759, and An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, usually just abbreviated as The Wealth of Nations, or on this PowerPoint, WN, which was published in 1776. Fun fact, or as close to a fun fact that you can get when you're doing economics, my quasi-fun fact about Adam Smith is that Charles Townsend read Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, and after reading the book, decided that there was nobody better than Smith to tutor his stepson, who was the Duke of Buccleuch. And so Townsend contacted Smith and got Smith to tutor his stepson, and they traveled all over Europe. They spent a lot of time in and around France. That's where Smith met Francois Quesnay and the school of economics that Quesnay was developing in France, called the Physiocrats. And rumor has it that Smith was going to dedicate The Wealth of Nations to Francois Quesnay, but Quesnay died before The Wealth of Nations was published, and apparently it wasn't sort of socially accepted at the time to dedicate a book to somebody who wasn't alive. And so there was no dedication to Quesnay. But certainly there was a great deal of influence going from Kenne to Smith, and there were also a bunch of differences between the two, and I'll talk about one or two of those briefly. Okay, next slide. And just a little bit about the world that Adam Smith grew up in. There was almost no growth, and not almost no growth at the time, there was almost no growth for centuries. Economies were basically sort of flat in terms of the growth of output. Growth of income didn't increase, and people were not living, really great lives. There was no improvement. On top of that, there was little or no intergenerational mobility. If you grew up a peasant, you died a peasant. If you grew up sort of little craftsman, you repaired and made shoes, then your children wound up doing the same thing. They were repairing and making shoes. If you were a landowner, then the oldest son of the landowner would inherit the entire land. The other children would sort of be on their own, and they might go down a little bit in terms of their economic mobility. But really, there was little or no mobility. Where you were born determined, by and large, what your life was going to be like. In addition, there was, besides the no economic growth, there were a good deal of fluctuations in economic growth, and a lot of that was a result of the harvest for the year. Bad harvests meant there wasn't enough food to go around. It led to starvation. Good harvests meant that people had more to put into their mouths, more to sustain themselves. More people wound up living. Most babies died before they reached the age of 5. Those who survived were stunted, illiterate, and sickly. There were very high poverty rates. Disability was great. Lots of people were unable to work. And last but not least, when Smith was beginning to write, we had the very beginnings of capitalism, the development of factories and the movement of production from cottages or within families into factories. And that was what Smith was trying to understand. Okay, next slide. Oops. No title on this slide, which means it's time for our audience participation segment of the presentation. And what I would like everybody to do, since part of the reason I'm here is a year ago, when we had another Adam Smith presentation, I made some remarks about Smith, and sort of it stirred people up, I guess is the best way to describe it. And so before I go further, I thought maybe I would have people maybe put it into the chat section. Think about what you know about Adam Smith, what you've heard about Adam Smith, and just a couple of things in the chat section. If you don't really know, don't put anything there, because I'm going to just go through the chat section so that I have a sense of what people think about Adam Smith before I start talking about Adam Smith. But if you take a couple of minutes to put your comments down in the chat section, I'll skim through them quickly, and then we can move on to the next slide. Is that clear to everybody?
Right. It may take a couple of minutes, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, that's, I'm figuring you can write things down for a couple of minutes, and I'll try to summarize them all for myself and for everybody.
Yeah, we hoped you know something about Adam, but
if it's all nothing, then that's okay. But no comments from anybody? Wow. Well, I know there are economists there, so they've got to know something about Adam Smith, even if the philosophers don't. Let's see. Okay, I've got a hand raised. George, go ahead.
Sorry, you said there was no growth. But if there was a population growth, then it must have been either negative growth of the GDP per capita.
And yeah, but there was also, again, this is, well, it's England, but it's really most of the world as well. There was population growth in the good times, but at the next bad harvest, that would stop. Population was growing very, very slowly. Economies were growing very, very slowly. And this was for hundreds of years. There was virtually no growth.
Steve, you've got a few in the chats now.
Okay, let's see. Well, okay, good. Adam Smith had much less liberal right-wing views. Okay, well, I do appreciate that the economists know something about. Oh, watch out for our invisible hands. Okay, yeah, okay, all right. Natural price, etc. Okay, yeah, the economists know a little bit about it. Let's see, Guillermo calls him the first classical economist. As I said earlier, I did do my dissertation on Francois Quesnay and the physiocrats. And based on all of my studies, I would dispute that and rate Francois Quesnay rather than Adam Smith as the first classical economist. But that's not what I want to talk about. Okay, good. Ronan, good. I think Adam Smith believed in letting the economy run itself, the concept of invisible hand. Markets will grow, regulate themselves. Yeah, that's, and then there's Rob to everybody, the Adam Smith joke, watch out for the invisible hands. Good. Okay, that's sort of what I expected I would get, except from a couple of economists who actually knew a whole lot about Adam Smith, and maybe some of the debates and disputes about what Adam Smith really thought. So we're ready to go on now. Move to the next
few
slide.
more, but anyway.
And
Okay.
I'll talk a little bit about sort of where this view came from, as well as the view itself. The main aspects of the popular view of Adam Smith is he believed in this thing called the invisible hand that would solve all of our economic problems. The invisible hand was sort of the free market or the price system allocating resources efficiently. His policy solution was laissez-faire, just keep the government out of the market, out of people's businesses, and this would improve everybody's standard of living and also give everybody a whole lot more freedom. And I think historically that view has been perpetuated by a whole bunch of rather conservative economists who wanted to claim Adam Smith, who is generally regarded as the father of economics, despite my claims that that really deserves to be Francois Quesnay. And the continual pushing of this idea again and again and again and again has let it seep into most interpretations of Adam Smith. Paul Samuelson's textbook in economics, which educated millions of students and probably tens of thousands of teachers of economics over the years, listed the sort of Adam Smith as being a believer in the free market and laissez-faire. Even somebody who I thought was just a little bit more sort of cognizant of Smith and the history of thought, and who I generally admire as an economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, even took the view of Smith that he really didn't believe in a lot of government intervention in the economy, very minimal, the defense of the nation, public works, things of that sort. But the real conservative economists, the Chicago School of Economics, usually associated with Milton Friedman and laissez-faire and just keep the government out of any economic role in the economy. That's the current popular view of Adam Smith. The other popular view of Adam Smith comes from the public choice school, sometimes called the Virginia school, which argues that the government itself is influenced by business interests, and if we let the government run things, then how the economy runs is just going to be influenced by the wealthy business interests. But I want to talk. I do want to talk a little bit more about what Adam Smith actually said about the invisible hand and laissez-faire. And I'm going to, I think, start first with laissez-faire because that's really the easiest one to talk about. Adam Smith never used the phrase laissez-faire, and only once used an expression that was close, somewhat close to laissez-faire, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the government at all. It was views of business firms that wanted the government to just not do anything and stay away from interference in the economy. In terms of the invisible hand, in all of the works of Adam Smith, the phrase invisible hand appears 3 times and 3 times only. One time was in a little essay that Adam Smith wrote on astronomy, which wasn't published until after his death. And he used the invisible hand as a way to describe how, he called them savages, uneducated savages, would understand thunder and lightning. And the way they understood thunder and lightning is it was due to the invisible hand of Jupiter. And so that had really no economic meaning whatsoever. The 2 other uses of the invisible hand occurred once in the theory of moral sentiments and once in the Wealth of Nations. In the theory of moral sentiments, the invisible hand was all about unintended positive consequences of somebody acting. And it talks about landlords providing more food for their serfs in bad economic times so that they wouldn't starve. In the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith talks about investors who have decisions about where they were going to invest, where they were going to start up a factory. And they really had 2 choices, Adam Smith said. They had a choice of doing the factory within their own country domestically or setting up a factory in another country. And Adam Smith said, well, based upon the preferences of the individual business owner, they may prefer to have the factory set up domestically rather than abroad. And Adam Smith said if this was the case, there were some positive consequences that were good for the nation, which is the factory would be set up in the nation. It would result in more revenue for the government. It would result in more jobs. And so it would have a positive effect. But this is not the market working. These are people's decisions that they made, their preferences, and they had unintended consequences. So there's no invisible hand that somehow solves all economic problems in Adam Smith. That ain't there. Laissez-faire ain't there. What is there, though, is the 3rd point, which is that there would be improvements in the standard of living and greater freedom for all as a result of the development of manufacturing. And the very early chapter of The Wealth of Nations, probably one of the more famous passages in all of economics, talks about the improvements made in a factory, the additional number of pins that could be made in the factory as a result over having people do this in their own homes. And Smith talks about how the division of labor leads to people specializing in a task and being more adept at it. They reduce the amount of time that they've got to go from one task to the other, and they come up with discoveries to improve their performance in one task because they're spending all of their time doing this and thinking about it. And so the factory would produce more pins. The more pins would be more output. It would improve everybody's standard of living. But there's still the problem of this damn factory only produces pins and people can't live on pins alone. So somehow the standard of living has to increase. And there are two other things that lead to the increase. One is the tendency to truck and barter. And the tendency to truck and barter means we can trade pins or sell pins and get money and then use the money to buy food and other things that improve the standard of living of the average worker. And then the other thing that was important for Smith, and I think this is part of the reason he has the reputation of being a free market economist, is for Smith it was the extent of the market that was important. The greater the market, the more incentive there is for individuals to set up the factory and produce the 4,000 pins per person rather than the 20 pins per person that could be done if everybody was producing pins in their home. And so this was Smith's argument for free international trade. The physiocrats had their own argument for free international trade, which influenced Smith when he met with the physiocrats. And both of these were designed to overcome the mercantilist views of how do we improve the standard of living of a nation. And according to the mercantilists, it was by getting gold into the country, because gold was wealth, not goods, not standard of living, but gold. And the more gold we had, the better off everybody would be. And if we did manage to have a trade deficit, we would sell our goods to other countries, get gold in, and that would improve the wealth of the nation, of our nation. And so that was sort of Smith's general view. Next slide. Good. And so Smith did oppose mercantilist trade restrictions. He was certainly against that. Smith also opposed monopoly because he recognized that business firms had this tendency to get together and conspire to raise prices to the benefit of the rich business owners and against the workers that they sold their goods to, and also that the rich business owners managed to influence the government to give them some monopoly power, and that would wind up hurting the average worker. Other than those two things, though, Smith is pretty liberal, not in the liberal sense of the time that Smith was writing, meaning no government intervention in the economy, but liberal in today's sense, whereby it really was a matter of the government needing to do things to improve people's standard of living. And I give a whole bunch of examples from The Wealth of Nations further on. Book 5, Chapter 1 focuses on Smith coming up with public policies to combat poverty and liberty. He supported higher wages, which I'll talk about in a minute or two. He supported taxing rents and the wealthy and progressive taxation. Just to give you an example, at the time there were no income taxes, but Smith was opposed to putting taxes on beer, the drink of the working class, but wine and other alcoholic beverages he wanted a much higher tax on because that would be taxing the wealthy. He opposed all forms of forced labor. He supported public regulation of paper money. He supported government public health measures. He even required that there be walls put in between houses and apartments to prevent the spread of fire. About 100 years before Smith was working on The Wealth of Nations, which he did while he was out with the future Duke in France and Europe. The Great Fire of London, 1666, pretty much leveled the entire city of London. One response to that was, well, we need government regulation of housing in order to prevent another fire. And then the last, and what has always fascinated me the most, is Smith supported ceilings on interest rates. And I talked earlier about how in bad economic times, a lot of people would wind up starving. One of the ways to get around that is to borrow money in difficult times so that you could then use that money to buy food. And I'll get to talking about that with the higher wages in another few minutes. Okay, we're ready for Smith on wages. Paula? Whoever's forwarding this? Okay, good. Hopefully now you've been at least convinced that Smith cared about the poor and the average worker, and really was hoping to sort of do something and show that workers' lives could improve as we move from cottage production to factory production, or something that became capitalism. Again, that's another term that Smith never used in any of his writings, like laissez-faire. And when Smith was focusing on the average worker, The Wealth of Nations, Smith talks about the functional distribution of income. And the functional distribution of income is what determines the wages, what determines the profits, and what determines the rents on land. But before we get to that, we need to talk about Smith's theory of price, because that's where his theory of income and the distribution of income comes from. And Smith had two notions of price. One was the market price, and the other he called the natural price. The market price for Smith was the price that people bought and sold in the market, day-to-day trading. The natural price for Smith was a point of gravitation. It was the point around which market prices fluctuated. And Smith was well-read. He did know of Newton's discovery of gravity. He used Newton's notion of gravity when developing his notion of natural price. Like Newton's gravitational force, it was the point towards which natural prices tended, and his explanation was really quite simple. If the market price was less than the natural price, then firms, entrepreneurs would produce more of that good. They'd bring it to the market. There'd be more goods out on the market, and that would bring the market price. Let's see. Let me start that one again. If the market price was below the natural price, then entrepreneurs would bring less to the market. There'd be less of a supply, and that would push the natural price up. On the other hand, if the market price was above the natural price, they'd reduce the goods they brought to the market, and that would push the market price up. And so changes in the market price based on the behavior of the entrepreneur would bring the market price down towards the natural price. It was a point of gravity in the economy. And now Smith had, of course, had to sort of figure out what is it that determines the natural price of things. That was the unanswered question. And to try to get at that, he decided he was going to do three theories. A theory of the sort of natural price of labor, the natural price of land, and the natural price of capital. He did not do very well with anything other than wages. He actually had three different theories of the natural price of rent, one coming from the physiocrats. He had no theory of rent. And wages, he actually had a theory and an explanation. And the natural wage for Smith was subsistence wages, what was barely necessary to enable people to survive. And this was a gravitational force, just like the natural price was a gravitational force for the market price. And it worked quite simply. If the natural wage rose above subsistence, bare physical subsistence, that would enable more people to survive. Pretty soon you would have a lot more people going into the labor force. That would reduce the market wage, and the market wage would go down towards subsistence. On the other hand, if we had a bad harvest and the natural wage was really low, what would happen? A lot of people would wind up dying, children would not survive, labor force would shrink, and now businesses would be struggling to hire and find workers. And when businesses are struggling to get workers to produce goods for them, they've got to increase the market price that they pay to workers when they hire workers. And so the market wage winds up going to the natural wage. And so that's sort of what Smith said about wages. But that raises a big problem, because remember back to book 1 of The Wealth of Nations. Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations was all about how we were going to increase the wealth of the nation. And the answer that Smith gave was, it was the division of labor in the factory. The division of labor drove the increase in production of pins. It increased the production of other goods. That was our wealth, what we produced. That was what improved everybody's standard of living. But that's very different from the description of what this natural wage is. And if the natural wage heads towards subsistence, you have really 2 problems. One is workers' standard of living doesn't improve in absolute terms, but also it worsens in relative terms, because everybody else is getting richer, because we've got more pins and the standard of living is increasing, but workers' standard of living winds up staying the same. And so the problem that Smith encountered was, okay, what can we do? How can we get the natural wage to increase? And Smith had a relatively simple answer to that. And the answer is that the natural wage is somehow socially determined. What workers have to get paid is a function of what everybody expects, or socially what we think is acceptable. And the problem is that that really doesn't solve the problem. It's just not clear how and why social forces could beat out economic forces. And if you think about what happens to wages during bad economic times, during a depression, you've got a bad harvest on the one hand, you've got reduced manufacturing demand on the other hand, and what's going to happen? Workers are going to get laid off, and that's going to exert some downward pressure on wages, as typically happens in difficult economic times. And as Bill Baumol points out, Bill Baumol is sort of Princeton and NYU economist who came close in the 1990s to winning a Nobel Prize in economics. He was shortlisted, but Baumol looked at what happened to real wages in the UK and Europe from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, going back to about 1840, all the way up until the late 19th century. And Baumol said that it wasn't until the late 19th century that real wages started to increase for workers. And so all of this industrialization that Smith pushed didn't really wind up helping at all. It didn't improve everybody's standard of living. And so it's not clear that Smith really solved this problem. His economic theory of what determined wages really didn't show how the division of labor actually increased wages. In actual fact, it doesn't seem that it increased wages. And there's this dichotomy between the two. And I don't think the claim that wages are socially determined actually solves that problem at all. Next slide. I'm going to go to usury. Good. Second issue is the issue of usury. And we'll do a little bit of history first. And the Middle Ages were a time when charging of interest on loans was prohibited. And there was a reason for that. And the reason was that everybody who was borrowing money was borrowing money because they needed the money to survive for the year. And so charging interest on loans was thought to be something that took advantage of the poor. With the beginning of the Protestant Revolution, the question of usury changed a bit. It wasn't about should we charge interest at all, should it be allowed, but should there be limits on how much could be charged? So that was the debate at the time that Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations. Should there be any limits on interest? And when John asked me to give this little talk, I started doing a little bit of reading of Smith and also some reading of Jeremy Bentham, who's I'm going to talk about in a minute. But Bentham's arguments against Smith on usury have been one of these like brilliant things that have convinced a lot of people that Smith was completely wrong on usury. But the thing that really struck me the most when I was reading Smith gave a series of lectures. Their lectures are usually called Lectures on Jurisprudence, which was published in 1763. They were lectures that actually came from the notes of a student of his at the University of Glasgow. And if you remember the dates of the Theory of Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations from earlier in the presentation, you'll realize that this is really in that in-between period. That was when Smith was beginning to move from the Theory of Moral Sentiments to the Wealth of Nations. And a lot of the ideas and a lot of the sort of things that Smith says in the Wealth of Nations about government and the role of government all appear in the Lectures on Jurisprudence. But the one thing that struck me the most when I was reading the Lectures on Jurisprudence is that Smith, and I have the page number from the lectures, actually makes a case about natural and market rates of interest. And remember that the usury question is not about natural rates, it's about market rates. It's about how much should a moneylender be allowed to charge on a loan. And Smith talks about the market and natural rates as, again, the natural rate of interest is the point towards which the market interest rates gravitate around. And you can even think of the natural and market interest rates the way that Smith actually thought about the natural and market wages. The natural wage for Smith was what enabled workers to really reproduce themselves. It was that bare subsistence level so that workers received this and a couple of their kids would survive so that when they got too old to work anymore, their kids would go and work. And then their kids would live a poor life and they'd have a couple of kids who would survive. And then those kids would wind up having kids who then would receive the natural wage. And Smith was talking about natural and market interest rates in this sort of framework. And Smith then goes on, and this is in the Wealth of Nations also, about interest rate limits of around 5%. Smith says that this 5% would be greater than the natural price, although I have not been able to find anywhere any estimate that Smith gives about what the natural price would be. But by analogy, I would take it as something like the following. It would be the rate of interest that would enable money lenders to reproduce themselves so that their kids would then, next generation, be the people lending money to the poor people further, in the future who needed to borrow money during difficult economic times. And so the limit on interest rates would be somewhat above the natural price, but it would also wind up allowing lending to the poor without the sort of long-run harm from debt in those bad economic times that you would get if interest rates were around 10%, which Smith talks about and says, no, this is way too high. This will create all sorts of debt problems for low-income households. So that's sort of Smith on usury. Next slide. Now we're going to get to Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham wrote just brilliant, absolutely like devastating critique of Smith, called The Defense of Usury in 1787. And he criticized Smith on a number of grounds for his views on usury. And again, Bentham took Smith to be this free market economist and starts by arguing that Smith was all in favor of free markets except for usury. And this is just inconsistent with all of Smith's other writings in The Wealth of Nations. How could Smith do this? And then Bentham went on to detail a whole lot of reasons why this sort of limit that Smith wanted to place on interest rates was bad. It would lead to black markets. It would wind up hurting the poor because at lower interest rates, people wouldn't lend to the poor. Businesses would wind up being hurt. And again, remember, businesses and the factories, that's the sort of factor that generates that economic growth for Smith. Those are the plants and the firms that are starting up. And Bentham worried that, well, nobody would lend to businesses, a risky endeavor, if they could lend at only the 5% market interest rate. Bentham also thought that crime would wind up increasing because the poor who need food, don't want to die, would go and engage in robbery, and maybe even worse, in order to feed themselves and their family. And Bentham also objected to the fact that somehow Smith would think that the poor didn't really know what was in their own interests, and the politicians that were going to set this 5% interest rate would know a whole lot better. And then last but not least, the devastating critique closes with, well, you're going to pass this horrible law and people are going to just like not trust laws and governments because you've got this horrible law, and people will learn to break the law, and we don't want to live in a world like that. And so if you read Bentham, it's cruel, it's brilliant. If you're an analytical philosopher, as I was at one point in my career, you love it because it's sort of clear and to the point, and just rips Smith to shreds. And the question that has been raised about this is like, was Bentham right, and was Smith convinced or not? There is one little bit of evidence that indicates that Smith was convinced by the arguments of Bentham, which comes in a biography of Smith by John Ray. And Ray's biography quotes a friend of Bentham. And the friend of Bentham says that Adam Smith told a mutual friend by the name of William Adam that Bentham was right when it came to usury. And so we have second or third hand that Smith said to somebody who said to somebody else that he was wrong when it came to limits on interest rates. There is no other evidence that this remark was made by anybody, as far as I could find. And in addition, and I think more strongly, the last version of The Wealth of Nations, which was published 1 year before Smith's death in 1790, again, pay attention to the date, made no changes at all in the sections on usury as a result of Bentham's criticism in 1787. So that makes me highly skeptical of the fact that Smith was convinced by the arguments of Bentham. And next question is sort of, why wasn't he convinced? And I think there are a couple of reasons, and they all have to do with who was actually doing the borrowing when Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations. And as in the sort of past, most of the borrowing was done by the poor. Businesses were actually not doing borrowing from money lenders when Adam Smith was writing in the last part of the 18th century. Businesses that were starting up, borrowing was generally done based on family members. One family member or a group of close family members would throw some money together and they would start up a business. And so it's not clear that the businesses that Smith supported, the people starting up the factories, would wind up being hurt by these interest rate ceilings. The poor would benefit. And then last but not least, Smith feared the speculators, or what he called the projectors, who borrowed money for wealthy projects. And in his lectures on jurisprudence, Smith talks for a while about John Law's South Sea bubble and how that was like a bad idea, and that was just going to lead to economic problems and disasters. To think of more recent examples of what Smith was talking about, think of the stock market bubble of the 1920s, followed by the 1929 stock market crash, which led to the Great Depression, or the housing bubble in the mid-2000s, which led to the bursting of the bubble in 2008, which led to the Great Recession. And so I think Smith was actually on relatively good grounds when he was arguing for, yes, we need some ceiling on interest rates, and this would be something that would be for the good of the nation rather than for the bad of the nation. And again, this was another instance in which Smith supported more government regulation of the economy for the benefit of the wealth of the nation. Okay, last slide. Hopefully I'm going to pull everything together for you. I guess the first takeaway from the presentation that I hope you get is that Smith was not the free market economist he's usually made out to be. Quite the contrary. Smith was concerned about average wages, average workers, how to improve their standard of living. And he approved a whole lot of government intervention in the economy that laissez-faire conservative economists don't like, and go against the grain of the conservative economists who want to claim that Adam Smith was one of their own. It's always great to stand on the shoulders of somebody who's regarded as the father of economics, correctly or incorrectly. The second sort of takeaway is that Smith supported higher wages, but really didn't see how to achieve this. The division of labor really doesn't do it, nor does a subsistence wage do it. There are reasons why Smith developed his theory of wages. There's history that indicates that wages really didn't grow for at least the first 100 years or so of the Industrial Revolution. And I think the problem is that Smith didn't have any other answers. But now I want to just switch from wages to interest, because there Smith had an answer to how to help the average family, how to help the average worker. And it was interest rate ceilings so that individuals don't get too indebted during bad economic times, during times of bad harvests, during times of slow, low demand when workers were thrown out of work and businesses were trying to cut their wages. And I sort of look at this as Adam Smith actually, in the case of interest rates and usury, found some low-hanging fruit. In fact, it's almost the definition of low-hanging fruit, mainly because there were usury laws at the time that did this. And Adam Smith saw this, he understood what this did, and he realized that this actually didn't have any harm on the growth of nations, but on the other hand, really made a big difference in terms of low-income families. Nonetheless, or in addition, I guess, despite the vigorous critique of Bentham, it seemed as though Smith was unconvinced that we should let markets determine the price of money or the rate of interest. He would rather put a floor or rather put a ceiling on, you jumped ahead again. Can we go back one more?
Yeah, it's not working. Give me a second.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. But Smith was unconvinced that we should have markets determine the price of money or the rate of interest, and that was just an easy solution for him. It was right in front of him. But I actually think that if Smith lived 100 or so years later, there would have been a very simple solution for him in the case of labor. This is the solution that governments throughout the world have developed over time, and something that Smith would have supported for the same reason that he supported interest rate ceilings. And first is the minimum wage. The minimum wage really began in the late 19th century in New Zealand and Australia. Now, 100 years after Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, Smith didn't have the notion of there needs to be a minimum wage as a solution to the problem of workers are only going to get paid enough so that they don't starve to death and can reproduce themselves and have a couple of children to go work in the factory or work in the mines. Labor unions didn't start until the 1820s in Manchester. So having unions oppose business firms that are conspiring to cut wages and raise prices wasn't a possible solution either. That didn't come until much later. Another problem at the time was families with more children had greater needs for subsistence, but there was no way firms were going to wind up paying workers more money because they had more children. And the solution to that became policies that are today known as family allowances or child allowances. And the instances when this began, it was in France and Belgium in the mid-19th century. The policies were started first at the firm level, then at the city level, and they didn't work because everybody soon recognized that the firms that didn't provide it, the cities that didn't provide it, would have a competitive advantage over other firms in other cities, and it had to be a national policy. And it wasn't until the mid to late 19th century that France and Belgium and other countries wound up setting forth policies of child allowances where the government provided extra funds to families based on the number of children to help raise the standard of living of families, that this problem of how to improve the standard of living of the average family was solved. Okay, now the last PowerPoint slide. We're ready for it. Oh, and the hand even moves. That's good. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So thank you.
Yeah, Steve, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. So, Ala, can you stop sharing now, please?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution. Okay, and then Steve, you yourself, I guess you should put yourself on gallery view, if you can do that.
How does one do gallery view?
Top right-hand corner.
Yeah.
Where
I'm on gallery view.
Yeah, so I'm gallery. So you can see everyone, right? basically.
I can see, yes, I can see everybody,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, so we can proceed like you self-moderate, as we say, which is not as bad as it sounds. And
Well, I can call on people. I just can't put my PowerPoints
no,
up.
but everyone to ask questions of Steve, basically use the yellow hand thing.
Yeah, use the yellow hand. I'll call on you based on seeing the hand up. Edith, I saw your hand up, then it went down.
Oh, that's just mainly to congratulate you for an excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so off you go, Steve. Questions, please.
Well, I'll take more comments like that if you'd like. Rand? Ronan? Is that right? No, it's Rand. Yeah.
No, I couldn't unmute. You mentioned he didn't like monopoly.
Yeah.
Did he get into anything like commercial law or business regulation, or how did he foresee the economy unfolding, say, from a competition point of view?
Well, Smith wanted there to be what economists call something like perfect competition. And he really didn't, as far as I could tell, he really didn't know how to get rid of the monopolies. He recognized really that you can't stop them. I mean, his famous line, or one of his famous lines from The Wealth of Nations, was about how businessmen, and they were all businessmen at that time, didn't get together without coming up with some sort of conspiracy against the public to raise prices and to lower wages. And I don't think Smith saw any out to that. I think, like the case of how do you support the wages of the average worker, it really wasn't until the late 19th century that we at least started to come up with some antitrust laws that would keep a little bit of competition going. But Smith was opposed to monopolies, and he did see the sort of the individual entrepreneur, the small businessman, as being the driving force for economic growth.
But he never got into the things like commercial law to make.
No.
Okay.
No. And I've read that actually the lectures on jurisprudence are actually called the lectures on justice, police, revenue, and arms. And it really covers Smith's complete thinking on the role of government in the economy. And a lot of it is sort of police, a lot of it is taxes, and a lot of it is defense and justice. There's not a lot else other than all of these regulations for public health and other things. But most of it focuses in on these are the things that we do. We know we can do them, and they've been done.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you. Leslie?
Yeah, I was curious when you talk about Smith's ceiling of interest rates. Did he have any sort of papers or comments in regard to the impact of the low cost of capital and the implications of getting further into debts because of the cheap cost of borrowing money, as we're seeing in today's society?
I think Smith saw this sort of natural interest rate as sort of being this Goldilocks interest rate, not too high, not too low. And so it wouldn't lead to people borrowing money and getting into more debt that they can handle because the rate was too high. And on the other hand, I think he recognized that the money lenders wouldn't lend out the money at interest rates that were too low.
Right. Okay.
And even for the speculators, he thought that this 5% ceiling would wind up driving all of the speculators out of the market, because nobody would lend to them at 5%. Now, the money lenders would want 10% or more if they were going to start up some really risky endeavor.
Right, of course.
And so you've got money lenders. Who are they going to lend money to? They're going to lend money to poor families that need it to survive. And they're going to lend it to businesses that are starting up and don't have the funds internally within their family.
Okay.
And this would lead to the factories, and then the factories would engage in the division of labor, and we'd produce more output, and then everything will be fine and wonderful.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. John?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. Yeah, I mean, I've always been a fan of Mr. Smith, and I guess it's because of his ethical and moral stance on things. He wanted to see human flourishing, he wanted to see happiness, he wanted to see innovation, and he really felt that you could create an economy that could do that. And I find these Bitcoin guys a little bit like that too. The people that are heading it up, they're kind of saying the same things, that the economy has to be based on some type of foundation that's fair and that's available for everybody to get involved with, to take a fair stake, that speculation, inflation is not part of it, but what matters is your human labor, and you get a fair return on that, and innovation. Am I wrong?
Well, I look at Bitcoin as really being a sort of cross between pump and dump and a Ponzi scheme. The money's not going anywhere to produce anything. A lot of it is just going to avoid paying taxes or avoid various government restrictions.
I guess what I'm saying is that they talk about it from moral perspectives, like Adam. Moral outcome.
No,
I'm not saying the Bitcoin thing.
Okay.
I'm just talking about how they're selling it and how they're promoting it.
Well, look, if I wanted to sell something and promote something, how would I do it? Moral reasons and economic reasons. It's good for the economy, and everybody benefits, and it's fair, and gives everybody freedom, and right. That's
yeah. No, I agree.
Right? That's how things get sold.
Okay,
and sometimes the things that are sold actually are an improvement, and sometimes they're not. And then the question is, how does an average person make that distinction or not?
Okay, but getting back just to saying if they're sincere about it, or saying that an economist is sincere about human flourishing, fairness, justice, and creating an economy that gives those outcomes. Is that how a general economist thinks? I feel that Adam Smith felt that, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think Adam Smith felt that way. I think you're right. I think an average economist today doesn't think that way. An average economist today thinks that thinks sort of in the way that, like, the standard view of Adam Smith that I talked about briefly, right, is the way to get an economy to thrive, which is the price system is let to do its work. It allocates goods, it allocates production, it allocates income. It does it more efficiently than anything else. And again, that's like Smith's pin factory. You get more output if you're doing things more efficiently. And so the sort of traditional economic view now is we're gonna sort of have the price system work to improve output because everything's being done more efficiently. And we're not even going to be talking about fairness. Really what's going to happen is the standard of living is going to increase because if we've got more output, everybody can gain.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And that's what he means. That's kind of a moral outcome. It's not because you're concentrated on fairness, but you can construct an economy that will lead to those results. But like he was all like everybody's so concentrated on wages, right? That wages have to increase. Why do wages have to go up if our human output for our 8-hour day is increasing? We should just be able to buy more with the wages that we have, constant wages. And that's what the Bitcoin guys will say, that it doesn't have to be. That's where things get all messed up. When Mr. Bernanke can go out there to the ocean and just with a fire hose put in trillions of dollars into the ocean, all my savings that I've done for the last 20 years means nothing. It's been diminished because he's printing and everybody else is printing. And that's not fair. And I think I would agree with that.
I'm not sure that if it's the printing that's causing the inflation, but the other thing to remember is that Bitcoin is not like money. Money does lose its value due to inflation, but even if you take some of the higher inflation numbers right now, 8%, 8.5%, that's still nothing compared to how much Bitcoin has lost within the past year. So Bitcoin doesn't keep its value.
Bitcoin hasn't been accepted as a mode of currency in doing trade. It's the philosophy of Bitcoin. I'm not a fan of Bitcoin. I just heard a lecture on it a few days ago. But if you hear it, there seems to be a lot of sense to it. Sense that you're sitting on a foundation that you just can't go and start printing money recklessly and to bail out this one or bail out that one. Because money is a representation of energy. I go to work, I save some energy, my human capital, my human labor. I put it in the bank, and then Bernanke prints, and diminishes that because it's not property; it's like a security, and it loses its worth. That the goods and services that I sold and made become worth less because of all the printing. And you're printing it and give it to your cousin. You know what I mean? That's the way I look at it.
Well, first, yeah.
I'm not saying they do.
But just a couple of things. One is central banks don't print money and just drop them on people with helicopters. What central banks do, if you just listen to the news, is they push interest rates up and down. And they push interest rates up and down in order to both on the one hand, in order to increase spending, cutting interest rates, and on the other hand, raising interest rates in order to reduce spending. And it's mainly the government that has been dishing out the money to people, that has been giving households the additional funds to be able to.
So they're borrowing from the bank.
In order to buy food, in order to pay the rent. And at some point the options are you have people starving because they don't have jobs, or you have the government somehow engaging in deficit spending in order to make sure that during these bad economic times people don't die.
So you think that's what the government's been doing, making sure?
I think that's what. I think that's part of what the government's been doing.
In the latter phase of COVID, pre-COVID, no, 2008, absolutely not.
And you look, we can question whether they've done too much or too little or about the right amount, but that's essentially what they're doing. But remember, it's not just the COVID that's like affecting the spending of the whole economy. There's also the tax cuts, at least in the US, the tax cuts by Republican presidents and a Republican Congress that is just giving effectively money to business firms and the wealthy instead of taking that revenue in and then using that revenue either to pay back past debt during difficult economic times or to take purchasing power out of the economy. Politically, right now, we're unable to raise taxes on the wealthy in order to slow down spending. And so we don't have any other option now but having the Central Bank of the United States raise interest rates in order to try to reduce inflation.
I guess to conclude, all I'm trying to say is I felt Smith, via his moral sentiments, that he had a moral view of outputs that the economy should create. Have we lost that? And therefore...
Oh, yeah, no, we lost that. Yeah, okay. All right.
And is that causing trouble? Is that causing problems?
I think, yeah, the answer is...
That
yeah,
view had continued through Smith and onwards.
Well, yeah.
Would the world be a little less volatile in the way, like it just seems this whole money thing is...
Well, let me
a lot of crap.
Let me see if I can answer that with respect to at least the U.S. economy over the past 40 some odd years, because really up until the early 1980s, we had a fairly good extended period where real wages increased fairly significantly in the United States. The middle class grew. This was what Smith wanted. Remember all of the PowerPoints about Smith trying to help workers. The wealth of the nation was not just producing more, but producing more and getting it to be broadly distributed. We did that. And then starting in about 1980, all of a sudden that stopped. Worker wages have not increased. Median household incomes in the United States have not increased. Why? Well, some of it had to do with the role of the government in the economy. It was governments, just decided that they were going to cut taxes on the wealthy. The wealthy took that as a signal that we can make a whole lot more money and not have to pay it to the government if we squeeze wages or keep workers' wages from increasing with their productivity. We can have more money for us and we can become wealthier. And if you just look at income inequality figures, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, the United States is much worse than anywhere else. Thomas Piketty is probably the most famous economist who's developed those figures and has publicized those figures. There's just been a really sharp increase in inequality. It's gone mainly to the top 0.1%. The owners of the corporations, the CEOs that are running the corporation. That's where the wealth is going. So yeah, the economy is growing. Yeah, the stock market's increasing, but who's gaining? And I think Smith would be aghast to see that what's essentially been called the free market policies, getting the government out of the picture, not supporting labor. Tax cuts for the wealthy, rather than progressive taxation, I think Smith would be aghast. And I also think that that's a large part of the reason why wages have stopped growing. Okay. I hope that answered your question.
Yep.
Rob, I think you were next.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I really liked your slides, Steve. They were
Thank you.
easy to read and easy to follow.
I'm a minimalist when it comes to PowerPoint.
But that really helps, especially on Zoom.
Good to know.
Just one thing, a word that caught my attention, the word subsistence. And I can remember Adam Smith's time, subsistence living was something that was kind of fairly unchangeable, maybe for centuries. I mean, he had idea of what subsistence living meant. And I think that's radically shifted probably the idea of what subsistence living means since then. So just some disjointed thoughts on that word subsistence. I'm wondering if they, there's two aspects to it. There's what the victims will tolerate as a definition of subsistence living. And I guess the other thing, which I think maybe has caused a shift, is what the observers, will tolerate in terms of observing, people living at a subsistence level. I'm just wondering if you or Adam Smith had any thoughts about that idea of the word subsistence and what it means, the definition, and possibly the shifting of that definition, maybe for reasons other than, Adam Smith himself maybe was an example of somebody who wanted to shift the definition of subsistence.
Well, I think Smith was hopeful that he could sort of like shift the definition of subsistence, or that the capitalist economy would shift the definition of subsistence. And as we were producing more and more and more, and as economies grew, as firms needed more workers, they would have to raise wages, and that then people would be accustomed to a higher standard of living, and then this higher standard of living would be accustomed to everybody. And there are a couple of passages in Smith. One, he talks about, I guess it's leather shoes as being part of subsistence or not. And his remark was that in France, remember, he had gone to France and studied the French economy. In France, people were not wearing leather shoes, but in England, they were. And so in England, this was part of subsistence. It was a higher standard of living. The other statement that Smith made, and this is one that Amartya Sen, philosopher and economist and Nobel Prize winner in economics, is always fond of bringing up. Smith effectively regarded subsistence as somehow being able to appear in public without shame. And so he thought that, people had to have at least a nice shirt, a nice cloth shirt, to be able to appear in public without shame. And when that happened, then the notion of subsistence, the notion of the bare minimum would rise. And it would continue to rise over time as a nation became more and more affluent. So that was really Smith's hope, is that would take place. But it didn't happen, or at least it didn't happen until the end of the 19th century. And when it did happen, it happened not because of the rise of capitalism, but the rise of governments being a little bit more involved in the economy, putting limits on how low wages could go, helping workers, putting limits on other things, on monopolies, so that there wasn't quite as much economic power in large corporations. And it was that which caused people's standard of living to rise. And we had a period of a fairly long period, again, with some ups and downs, especially due to a couple of world wars. But from about the end of the 19th century to about 1980, the end of the 20th century, when living standards rose by leaps and bounds. Middle class grew really throughout the world. And then somewhere around 1980, it stopped in the United States, and it somewhat stopped in other developed countries throughout the world. And the reason for that, on my reading, and I think Smith would probably agree, is the factors that led to the improvement in the standard of living, which was the government assuring that there would be like a floor on wages, the government assuring that there would be unemployment benefits, the government, now Keynes comes in, the government assuring that we don't get stuck in a depression for 20 years or 10 years. All of that has enabled wages to continue to grow and has stopped wages, at least from falling, back to bare minimum subsistence.
Right.
Did that answer your question?
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Okay, John, you're next up on my screen here. Unmute.
Fine. Yeah, unmuted myself now. Thanks a lot, Steve. I won't take up too much. By the way, I don't care about how I appear in public. I have no shame. I do have a substantive question about wages, but I'm going to leave that aspect of it till the end because I want other people to, have their questions with you. I just wanted to make a very quick comment on the exchange that you and John had. And the comment I have is it shows you how very difficult, if you want to put it this way, monetary theory is. You were talking about cross purposes about Bitcoin. Does printing money cause inflation? Is it really printing money? Isn't it, as you say, interests and so on. It just shows how very difficult monetary theory is. That's the point I want to make, and explains a little bit why these, endogenous money versus exogenous money, why these difficulties occur. Taking it back to Adam Smith, I want to point out, well, of course, there's exactly that same incoherence in Adam Smith. Adam Smith didn't really understand economic theory, and he didn't understand monetary theory, right? David Laidler wrote a paper talking Adam Smith as a monetary economist. And of course, he pointed out that Adam Smith assumed the background of a gold standard. So that should take care of all your monetary theory, inflation, the natural rate of interest, and and then on the other hand, he's talking about usury. He simply hadn't sorted it all out, and I guess we ourselves probably haven't sorted. I mean, there are people who are watching now, Mario, for example, who've made a much better fist, I would say, sorting it all out than has been done in the past. But I just wanted to make that general point. It's not surprising that there are these kind of, discussions at cross purposes. But I just wanted to make that point. Yeah.
No, and I think your point about like Smith not really figuring it out is right. I mean, what he was doing in The Wealth of Nations was struggling to figure something out. Struggling. He wasn't really even experiencing full-blown capitalism. This was just the beginning of capitalism.
That's a brilliant point that you make, Steve. Yeah.
And so I mean, he made a couple of important steps forward, but there was still a whole lot left to do following Smith. And even today, as you correctly pointed out, we still don't have it all down. It's not easy.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we should give up.
I'm not advocating that. Check out my new book.
Thank you for your question, John. Rand?
Steve?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good. Could you comment on the impact that Smith had on economics? He actually, as you mentioned, he wrote something on morality as well, and obviously his book on Wealth of Nations elicited some response from Jeremy Bentham. But could you just comment on what, if any, impact his economic theories had?
That's a good question. I mean, really, I think what I talked about earlier, which is sort of the conservative economists picking up Smith, is really the impact. It's Smith was the giant. He was the father of economics. We want to stand on the shoulders of Smith. Okay. Now, if they really stand on the shoulders of Smith, as I define Smith and as I described Smith, then a lot of conservative economists would not be very happy, because Smith was really a whole lot more about an active role for government helping ordinary workers.
But that's
okay. Very conservative economists saw in Smith these little bits. Smith liked free markets. He didn't like monopoly. He liked competition. And spun Smith, gave an interpretation to Smith that made the invisible hand the main theme of The Wealth of Nations, where the invisible hand was the market and price changes, and that ain't there. And it ain't in the one line that he has in the Theory of Moral Sentiments where he talks about the invisible hand. And it ain't in the astronomy essay where Jupiter's throwing lightning bolts and we don't know what's going on. And so we're unsure how to explain it, and we call it the invisible hand of Jupiter. All of the free market stuff, the laissez-faire, none in Smith. And I think a group of economists, and it really started early on. J.B. Say, a French economist, was the first one who attributed laissez-faire to Smith. But as I try to show, Smith never said that. But conservative economists who never liked government latched onto Smith and latched onto these interpretations of Smith and spun Smith and made that into the standard interpretation of Smith. Milton Friedman and the Chicago School loves Adam Smith because they believe that Smith was all about free markets, get the government out. And that then just filtered down, in part because nobody wants to read The Wealth of Nations.
But did he have was there any impact on the legislation of the period that he lived in or shortly thereafter? Or was all of this sort of justifications of a philosophy that we've adopted 200 years after? So in other words, were people, did he have any significant change to the economics of the time or after his time? Or was he just reflected on back now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the impact that Smith had was basically on impacting other thinkers, other economists who were trying to understand the way the economy works. And they either sort of decided that they were going to take Smith and move Smith a little bit forward, or in Jeremy Bentham's case, and Bentham is really one of the more conservative economists around, and one of the sort of people that started this, it's all about utility and we want to maximize utility nonsense, and the market will do that. Bentham just sort of skewers Smith. It's brilliant. Now, I love it. But it was a reaction to Smith. It was, we want to make Smith into this free market economist. His theory of usury and his remarks on usury don't do that. Is it an anomaly? And is it wrong? And Bentham basically said, yeah, it's wrong. It's not consistent with the rest of his thought. There are all of these problems. And I don't think that this had much effect at all. I just don't know enough about the history of usury laws. I think that the influence of Smith was not really Smith, but the influence of the interpretations of Smith as this free market economist. They've been continually pushed forward with bad results, because it leaves out the government and it leaves out the moral aspect that Smith was really struggling with, in addition to the economics.
But he advanced economic thought and economic ideas that therefore would have had effects on the economy later. Okay, that makes sense.
And look, the things that he said about monopoly and monopoly being bad were right, and eventually it did lead to some antitrust laws.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Ronan, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That was very interesting, really interesting. From what you said about Adam Smith, it sounds like he's a little bit of an incipient socialist. And, disabuse me of that idea if that's not what you were saying, but it did sound a little bit like you kind of were moving in that direction. So, taking that as a premise, would Smith argue that there should be more government intervention in terms of economic policy and in terms of money creation and giving money to the needy and so on. Like, how did he speak on this from your reading? And if he did speak on it, how much should the government be involved in the economy? And where would the money come from? Would it come by way of taxation? Like, how would all of that sort of transpire?
That's a good question, and thank you for asking it. First, with respect to socialism, Smith was not a socialist and was not even close to being a socialist. Smith had faith in small individual entrepreneurs, okay, and like they were his hero. They were the ones that were going to set up the factories. They were the ones that were going to come up with like a new product, a new discovery to produce things more efficiently that would improve everybody's standard of living. But there were problems he recognized with this system. And then to deal with these problems, Smith, I think, thought that we needed some sort of government regulation. And I think the usury case makes that clear. That's why I liked when I found that quote on Smith on usury in the lectures on jurisprudence. Is like Smith was adamant that, yeah, we need the government to just help make things better. The thing that also strikes me now, which I was thinking of talking about at some point during my presentation, Smith also recognized that there was a downside to the entire factory system. And the downside to the entire factory system, Smith said, is that workers were quickly becoming really stupid because all they did was the same thing again and again and again and again and again. And Smith said, well, we need a solution to deal with the problems of like the repetitive tasks, the stupidity of the workers, the illiteracy of the workers. And Smith actually pushed for increased schooling, increased literacy, and how that would actually help on the shop floor, the factory floor. And the other question that you raised was sort of how we go about getting the money. Smith was not a firm advocate of government running lots and lots of debt. And I think John mentioned something earlier about the difference between monetary systems now and monetary systems back in Smith's day. There were no central banks then. There were banks, but banks sort of held people's gold and gave out pieces of paper that said, this is how much gold you've got. And then you had to worry about, like, was it like true or not? Could we trust the bank? And Smith actually wanted like regulations on this, but he didn't want governments to actually borrow money. He thought the answer was a progressive system of taxation. And again, the time that he was actually writing and living, there were no income taxes. Nobody thought of income taxes. Nobody could figure out a system to make that would enable governments to do this. This didn't happen until the late 19th century, early 20th century in most countries. And so Smith fell back on, let's call it the second best policy. What do we tax? What can we tax? And for Smith, it was, you need to tax goods. Goods were the main thing that was taxed. And so what do? Well, you can tax luxury goods, whether they're imported or whether they're made domestically, you put a tax on. Now, the wealthy are being taxed. Or we're going to tax alcoholic beverages because we don't like people drinking so much and causing, sort of trouble in the streets and passing out in the streets. We want to sort of reduce that. So what do? Well, we need revenues, and we can get the revenues from people drinking. But Smith wanted a really small tax put on beer, which was the beverage of the average worker. Wine expensive liqueurs imported from elsewhere. Let's put the tax way up on that. He also talked somewhere about like carriages with horses, driving people through the streets. And there were toll plazas. Let's just tax the really expensive carts, a whole lot more than the little wagon that's not covered being drawn by one or two horses, right? And we can set up at least a progressive system of a sales tax so that we raise the funds necessary to do what the government needs to do, which of course always includes defense. It always includes police and right, all of the things that like make civilization possible and protect us from attack from abroad, but not put the burden on the average worker who's struggling.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I just want to say just one quick other question about Bentham. And I'm getting the impression you're saying Bentham's analysis of usury is really a misreading of Smith, that Bentham actually misread Smith, you think?
No, I actually don't think that Bentham horribly misread Smith. I think he got Smith right. Because Smith clearly says that he wanted there to be limits on interest because he wanted to make sure that the poor were not killed effectively by having to pay 10 or 20 today with like payday loans and car title loans and even credit cards. You get into debt and you never dig your way out. Smith didn't want that. And the way to get around that is you've got to limit the interest rates that can be charged.
And Bentham did not want to limit the interest rate.
Right, because Bentham was a free market guy and the market always knows best. And Smith was basically saying the market doesn't always know best. And Bentham was saying, well, based on the interpretation of the Wealth of Nations, that Smith was this free market guy, this is inconsistent with the rest of Smith. And by putting these ceilings on interest, you're going to create a whole bunch of other problems.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. Thank you very much.
Just as I said, I think it's a brilliant piece by Bentham, but it didn't convince Smith, and it doesn't convince me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was really interesting.
Thank you for your question, Stella.
Hi. This was very informative. And it's always interesting to me, especially as someone who, just like I always complain that philosophy is not a class in school, and a lot of like practical things I feel like have been taken away from school. We had this conversation the other day in one of my classes about how like driver's ed is not a thing, learning how to pay taxes is not a thing, basic economics is not a thing in school anymore, really. I mean, I'm sure it is somewhere, but it's definitely not a standard thing anymore in education. And it was interesting hearing, especially some of my older teachers, even compared to some of my younger teachers, being like, oh yeah, we didn't really get that in school either, versus like one of my teachers that's like in their early 60s was like, yeah, I think I caught like the tail end of that. And, so anyway, I do think that it's sad. So I always appreciate coming to things like this when they're always talking about economics, because I do feel like it's something that I don't get anything of in school. So if I want to learn anything about it, I have to do it my own way. So thank you. I just had a question about like what you mentioned limiting interest rates and stuff for like, and that's, I put in the chat how there is this general feeling around people in my generation, I feel like, of this like distrust in like work and being fully compensated, because now like people in my generation have grown up, a lot of us having like parents that are deeply in debt from their education and they're just living life and stuff. So now we're sort of dealing with the repercussions, at least in America and our society right now, of having parents being extremely in debt and having kids now watch that as they've grown up and watch their parents work really hard and have what most people would consider like fairly high paying jobs. And even I had that confusion a lot when I was little. I was like, how do you have two parents who work full-time jobs? And like, it doesn't make sense as a little kid. And for some reason, as we get older, we come to accept that, and or not accept it, but we're like, it becomes like it's, a fact of reality or whatever. But I think the purest sense of like justice and injustice can sometimes be seen through the eyes of little kids. And it's like, well, if you're working all the time and trying to do something or do something to provide for your family or whatever, and you can't do that, isn't that probably a sign of something else is the matter, not you, sort of thing, or not your family? And I'm just wondering, like, what you personally think that will sort of cause moving forward, now having my generation sort of entering the workforce and getting married and having children and going to higher education and stuff, and what now having an entire generation watch their parents or other older people in their lives go through a lot of this stuff post 1980s, post sort of this baby boom generation.
Well, that's a broad question and a great question. And that's something that I've not just worried about a lot, but I've also written about a lot. And what I have always struggled with is, when do we reach the limit? Like, how much debt can you push onto households and individuals before they can't handle it? And I haven't come up with the answer to that yet. But if you're going to the New School and studying economics, there's a possibility that you can help me come up with an answer. But for now, that's the best I can do. I wish I could do more, but thank you for your question. Iggy? Unmute.
I know. Sorry. Hi.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been putting my hand up, but for some reason it didn't stay up the last 20 minutes. But anyway, I finally found out it was stay up. Anyway, I'm a manufacturer in my real job. And one thing I've always argued, and Adam Smith, which I totally agree, is like, if you can produce domestically, that is the way to go, rather than setting up a factory internationally. And one of the big, and as far as the government goes, there is a great use for government in economy, and that's to help the small guy, the entrepreneur, the manufacturer, or the guy who wants to start, to help him as much as possible. Like in Canada, I know they do a lot, but they got to find a better, easier way to basically get funds so that these people can start a business, become manufacturers. Because I know people, not friends of mine, but I know people, they say, well, Iggy, why don't you just get it made in China and then sell it here? And I'm going like, well, that's, first of all, that's not me. Secondly, it's very detrimental to our economy. Okay. Totally. If you don't want to, that's why right now I believe China really is ruling the world, whether you want to believe it or not, because pretty much there's so much made in China, they control the world economy. Okay. And like, for instance, you go in the stores, well, it's Canadian Tire. Well, they should change it to Chinese Tire. Like, you're in the States, and I do deal with Walmart. Believe it or not, I have a product in Walmart Canada, and I did have one in Walmart USA, and they're basically the same thing, because human nature is, I'll take the easier way to make money, but in the long run, that has consequences on your local economy. Like, for instance, in this pandemic up here in Canada, they were saying, well, we can't get a mask, we can't get defibrillated, we can't get, and Ford, our premier, was saying, well, we should start a program to start encouraging people to manufacture these items. And it's not just being self-sufficient, because that's always great. So that's one thing that I really, really agree with Adam Smith. And I just wanted to point it out, because you think that, okay, it's made here, you're going to pay more. But in the long run, if it's made locally, as you want to say, then you're hiring locally. These people are getting more money, and that's the whole thing. So that's a statement I want to make.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Thank you for making it.
Okay.
I think it needs to be made. And just a follow up. one of the other questions that is puzzling me about where economies are going now is, how is this pandemic and all of these huge problems with supply chain going to wind up having, playing out in terms of long-term consequences? And it's with these like just-in-time inventories and these long supply chains going from Asia to the United States, where the cars are manufactured or assembled from parts, and the cars can't be assembled because we can't get the chips that are made in China, that are made in Japan, that are made in Taiwan for various reasons. And that's really causing problems that might cause firms to start thinking about bringing production back home.
Yeah, because it's scary. It's scary, Steve.
And recently, this must have been within the past couple of weeks, maybe a month, Intel announced that it was going to set up a chip manufacturing plant in Ohio.
Oh, well, that's yay.
And that's because, like, you can't get chips from Asia anymore.
Yeah.
Or it's really difficult for various reasons. And so they're going to set up a plant in Ohio. They're hopefully going to be able to make it work there.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the government should be doing. You know,
well, it's not the government that's doing this. Is Intel that's doing it.
I know that, but I mean,
the government needs to figure out like the right sorts of incentives and the right sort of support. And a lot of the support is infrastructure.
Yes, exactly. Okay, thank you. Yeah, great talk.
Thank you.
Okay, Steve, I see one more hand, and that should be the last one. Yes, John?
Okay. John?
Did you raise your hand?
Yes, he did.
But you are the last one, John. It's a lot of pressure on you.
Well, I thought Smithen was the last one. He had a big question at the end. He told us that he foreshadowed it earlier on. Okay. I've got a big question too. It's all in the same slide rule, but it might sound like 4 questions. Despite Bentham, Smith was unconvinced that markets should determine the price of money. A couple of things. Did Bentham and Smith see the market the same way we see the market now, or has been explained to us by Mr. Friedman? Number 2, do markets determine the price of money? Have they ever determined the price of money? Or is there an invisible hand doing it? The Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. I'd like to know the answers to those questions.
Those are just 2 questions. I thought you had 4 questions. I was gonna do 4 questions good, 2 questions bad.
It's in 2 time periods. This time,
I think that like economists' view of the market in a sense is like where people buy and sell things. That's pretty much been the same. There's not been a lot. The markets themselves have changed. They're less competitive than they were in Smith's time, no doubt about that, because you've got a whole lot more large firms that are dominating markets. You've also got advertising dominating the buyers, which you didn't have in Smith's time. In terms of the price of money or interest rates, the price of money or interest rates now is by and large controlled by central banks. Why do you have central banks? You have central banks announcing that they're pushing up interest rates, and that's going to have an economic impact. And that's the price. That's the price of money, or the price to actually go out and borrow money.
Okay.
And if money is more expensive, less people are going to borrow, and that's going to slow down economic growth. How much is another question.
Okay. Would it be better, as Bentham wanted, for the markets to determine the price of money or interest rates? And also, is the government part of the market? And how big of a share should it be?
Well, the central banks are basically the government.
You told me earlier it was the government that was pumping the money back into stocks and everything else.
No, it's the government. It was
told me half hour ago.
It was the government spending that was putting the money really out into the economy.
Is that part of the market?
That's not really part of the government. Is usually not regarded as part of the market.
Maybe it's become part of the market, and that's the problem. Too much of a part of the market, especially when it's pumping money. I don't know. I'm just asking.
I think that if you do sort of before and after, before government started to control money, before central banks, and after, before you pretty much had recession, depression every 6 or 7 years. The Federal Reserve in the United States was created after the, let's see, it was the like, I can't remember what it's called, the crash of like 1908, I think it was. It was a couple of banks went under in New York, and then there was the San Francisco earthquake, which leveled San Francisco. And so all of the money in the banks in San Francisco, everything was pretty much gone. The U.S. economy went into what was then called a depression. And after that, we had, and actually, at that point, it was J.P. Morgan and bankers in New York that were bailing out all of the banks that were ready to go under and destroy the system. And J.P. Morgan and the bankers had reached their limit of what they could do to help. And that was when the Federal Reserve of the United States was created. They didn't really know what they were doing and didn't do anything particularly well during the Great Depression. But after that, I think that central bankers learned enough to be able to at least do the right thing, cut interest rates during bad economic times, raise interest rates if there's inflation. The thing that they haven't gotten quite yet is how much. But I would sort of take the government pushing interest rates up and down a little over having the government sit there and do nothing. I know somebody here, John Smith, and who will disagree with me, who actually has a monetary rule named after him to have the government pretty much do nothing. But I do think that the government can do some good.
I don't want to delay it anymore. It's not doing nothing. It's keeping pace with inflation. They have to do something. It's a real rule, not a nominal rule. Anyway, but you know that perfectly. We've got a book coming out on that.
But again, Steve, so the government is or isn't part of the market?
Traditionally, the government is not part of the market.
In reality, John's a realist here. We're all in reality. Is it part of the market or not?
Well, what do you mean by the market? The market for
well, it
what?
determines the price of goods and services.
I mean, in some sense,
it determines the price of goods and services by purchasing and buying and spending. It is part of the market. It's obvious it's part of the market.
Yes, it's part of the market in the sense that one, they buy goods and services.
It's a very big part of the market.
And two, they give money to people to buy things in the market, although that's macro more than micro, but the government actually goes out and buys, so it affects micro markets, and it affects money markets because the Federal Reserve or central banks in general are government organizations that control the price of money, otherwise known as the interest rate, the nominal interest rate.
That's it, John?
Yes, Ed, I think it's all about finding the right balance, and I really don't feel the West is in balance right now between, and I think government's involvement in its sheer size and the guarantees that has been given in pensions and so on and so forth makes it very difficult. I'll just give you an example. My accountant figured it out 2 years ago. If I was to treat my employees, co-workers, We're a small business. We're what Adam Smith loves. We're a flourishing, we do very well. We deliver great goods and services. But when I see what our guys make in relative pay, the average pay in our place is probably about 27 bucks an hour, maybe a bit more. Considered a good private wage, right?
Mhm. Yep.
But if I was to treat them the same way that the average government worker in York Region gets in terms of what their pensions are, my shop rate would have to go from 100 bucks an hour to 375. When I buy something for $1 and rather selling it for $1.66, it would have to go from $1 to $6. That means every government worker is getting a huge subsidy when he comes into my place, and it's wrong. So Friedman's not wrong about that. I mean, I love Adam Smith and his moral outlook, but something ethically is really gotten wrong in the West, and that part is out of balance. Good people that work hard, that study as hard as any teacher, fireman, or cop, are making 1/3, 1/4 in real money when you take into account pensions. It's wrong. And that's economics. Something's wrong. I know there's a lot of school teachers out here and professors, but it isn't right. But if anybody wants to go for a beer tonight, I'll treat them.
Okay, Steve, it looks like we have questions answered. Thank you so much. It was fantastic and brilliant presentation. We posted on
Thank
YouTube.
everybody again for showing up and asking good questions.
Yes. And
Thank you, Steve. That was great.
thank you everyone for coming. See you
Thanks,
next
Steve.
time.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
We'll have a beer with you when you come to Toronto.
That sounds good. I'm hoping to make it in September.
Will it be via New York or via New Jersey?
I see an opportunity here. Steve has already asked me to buy him drinks in Toronto. Why don't you come and you buy the drinks instead?
I will. I've been buying drinks all my life.
Yeah, exactly. So,
but I didn't even know I was buying them drinks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve.
Well, thanks for inviting me, John.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a
Bye.
good night, everybody.
Good night, Steve.
Good night.